Soft rain whispered against the roof of the black Maybach as it glided through Seoul's evening traffic. Inside, Park Seo-Jin sat in complete silence. The man who ruled the city's underworld with flawless precision. Cold, controlled, untouchable. For years, nothing had been able to shake him. Not betrayal, not blood, not loss, until the car slowed to an unexpected stop. Seo-Jin's gaze lifted lazily toward the sidewalk, and then his entire body went still. Across the street, a woman knelt on the wet pavement, hurriedly gathering scattered groceries while shielding a small boy behind her. The movement was instinctive, protective, familiar. Seo-Jin barely paid attention, until the child turned. Dark eyes, dark, steady, identical to his own. Something cold twisted violently in Seo-Jin's chest. Impossible. His driver's cautious voice broke the silence. "Sir, should we proceed?" Seo-Jin didn't answer, because at that exact moment, Nia Adeyemi slowly looked up, and the boy standing beside her had his eyes. For the first time in years, the Ruthless Mafia king felt something dangerously close to fear. Park Seo-Jin did not believe in weakness. In the glass tower that overlooked the glittering spine of Seoul, everything moved because he allowed it to move. Markets shifted at his quiet command. Men twice his age lowered their eyes when he entered a room. Fear, carefully cultivated, was the currency that built his empire. And Seo-Jin never wasted currency. He stood at the far end of the executive floor, hands resting loosely in the pockets of his tailored charcoal suit, gaze fixed on the city below. Night had already begun to swallow the skyline, neon lights flickering alive one by one. To most people, the view was beautiful. To him, it was a map. Every district meant influence. Every shadow meant risk. Every light meant something that could be taken or protected. Behind him, the room remained perfectly silent. No one spoke unless he spoke first. "Status," Seo-Jin said calmly. His right-hand man stepped forward immediately. The Busan shipment arrived without interference. "However, there are rumors the Han faction is probing our southern routes." Seo-Jin's expression did not change. Rumors were noise. Fear was useful. But panic was for men who lacked control. "They're testing boundaries," Seo-Jin said quietly. "Let them." The temperature in the room seemed to drop, because everyone present knew what that meant. Seo-Jin did not rush wars. He ended them. His gaze returned to the window, voice smooth and emotionless. "Increase surveillance. No unnecessary movements. If they cross the line," he paused, "remove the problem." A soft murmur of acknowledgement followed. Efficient, precise, final. That was how Park Seo-Jin ruled. Not with rage, not with noise, but with a terrifying surgical calm that made stronger men hesitate. Because Seo-Jin never acted from emotion. Emotion was unpredictable. Emotion made men sloppy. Emotion was how he had almost made the worst mistake of his life. For just a fraction of a second, something unreadable flickered behind his eyes. So brief no one in the room noticed. So controlled it might not have existed at all. Almost. Seo-Jin turned smoothly from the window. The moment was gone. Buried. Where it belonged. Meeting dismissed. Chairs shifted quickly. Papers were gathered. Within seconds, the powerful men who commanded entire sectors of the underworld were filing out with quiet obedience. When the doors finally closed, silence settled again. Perfect. Controlled. Seo-Jin adjusted the cuff of his watch with slow precision, his reflection staring back at him from the dark glass. Cold. Untouchable. Unmoved. Just the way. Morning came early for Nia Adeyemi. It always did. By the time the first pale light slipped through the thin curtains of her small apartment, she was already awake, tying her hair back with practiced fingers while the kettle hissed softly on the stove. The space was modest, too modest for the dreams she once had, but it was clean, warm, and most importantly, safe. That was enough. For now. "Mama." Nia turned quickly, the tension in her shoulders easing the moment she saw Ethan standing sleepily in the doorway, his small frame wrapped in oversized pajamas. Her heart did its usual quiet squeeze. "Hey, my brave boy," she said gently, crouching to his level. "You're up early." Ethan rubbed his eyes. "You're going to work again?" The question was soft, careful. Too careful for a child his age. Something inside Nia tightened, but her smile never faltered. "Just for a little while," she promised, smoothing his hair back. "And when I come back, we'll finish your puzzle. Deal?" Ethan studied her face as if measuring the truth of her words. Then slowly he nodded. "Deal." Relief flickered through her chest. Children understood more than people realized. Which was exactly why Nia worked so hard to make sure Ethan never saw the cracks. By 7:30, she was already moving through the familiar rhythm of survival, packing Ethan's small lunchbox, double-checking his homework, mentally calculating how far this week's paycheck would stretch. Rent was due soon. The electricity bill sat folded on the counter like a quiet threat. But she didn't allow herself to panic. She couldn't afford to. Outside, the city moved fast and indifferent, swallowing people who couldn't keep up. Nia had learned that lesson the hard way. Years ago, she had believed in promises, in soft words, in a man whose eyes had once looked at her like she was the only thing in the world. Her grip tightened briefly on the strap of her worn handbag. That girl was gone now. Life had made sure of it. At the daycare entrance, Ethan's small hand clung to hers for just a second longer than usual. Nia felt it immediately, that quiet, instinctive tug. She knelt, brushing invisible lint from his jacket. "Remember what I told you?" she asked softly. Ethan nodded. "Be brave. Be smart. And don't worry about you." Her throat tightened, but she forced a warm smile. "That's my boy." Only when he finally walked inside did Nia allow herself one slow breath. Then she straightened her shoulders, lifted her chin, and stepped back into the rushing current of a world that had never once made things easy for her. Because Nia Adeyemi had learned something survival had carved deep into her bones. No matter how heavy life became, she would never let it see her break. By the time Park Seo-Jin returned to the tower, the city had already swallowed the rain. But the image hadn't left him. It lingered, sharp, unwelcome, persistent. Dark eyes, small shoulders, that impossible resemblance. Seo-Jin stood in his private office, the floor-to-ceiling windows reflecting the cold stillness of his expression. On the surface, nothing about him had changed. His posture remained precise, his breathing steady, his face unreadable. Only the slight tightening of his fingers against the glass betrayed the fracture underneath. Director Kim, the head of his intelligence unit, stepped forward immediately. "Yes, sir." Seo-Jin didn't turn. "Find her." 2 quiet words. But everyone in the room felt the shift. Director Kim hesitated only a fraction. "Name." For the first time, Seo-Jin's gaze flickered, not with uncertainty, but with something far more dangerous. Recognition. Nia Adeyemi. The name left his mouth smoothly, but something old and buried moved beneath the surface. Kim nodded once. "And the child?" Silence stretched for a beat too long. Seo-Jin's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Full background," he said at last. "School. Medical records. Daily movements. I want everything." No one asked why. Men in Seo-Jin's world learned quickly which questions shortened lifespans. Within hours, the quiet machine of his empire began to move. Cameras were reviewed. Public records pulled. Routes mapped. Not loudly. Not carelessly. Seo-Jin did nothing carelessly. Late that evening, a thin black folder appeared on the glass desk in front of him. He opened it slowly. First photo. Nia, outside a modest apartment building, Ethan's small hand tucked securely in hers. Second photo. The boy laughing on a daycare playground. Seo-Jin's eyes stopped there. The resemblance was worse in still images. Clearer. Undeniable. Something cold shifted in his chest, sharp enough to almost feel like memory. Director Kim spoke carefully from across the room. The child is registered as Ethan Adeyemi. No listed father. The air went very still. Seo-Jin's thumb rested lightly against the edge of the photograph, his gaze tracing the boy's features with quiet, surgical focus. The line of the eyes, the set of the mouth, the calm watchfulness far too mature for a child. A muscle in his jaw ticked once. "Continue observation," Seo-Jin said quietly. Kim blinked. "Sir." "No contact," Seo-Jin clarified, voice smooth but final. "No interference. I want eyes on them at all times." "Yes, sir." When the door closed behind his subordinate, silence returned to the office. Seo-Jin remained where he was, the city lights flickering across the glass like distant warnings. His gaze dropped once more to the photograph, to the boy, to the eyes that looked far too much like his own. 4 years, Park Seo-Jin had built an empire on certainty, on control, on never being caught off guard. But as he stared down at Ethan's small, serious face, for the first time in a very long while, the ruthless Mafia king was no longer completely sure of the past he thought he had buried. The results arrived at 2:17 a.m. Seo-Jin noticed the time without meaning to. He was alone in his private office, the city below reduced to scattered ribbons of light. The tower was quiet at this hour, the kind of silence that usually brought him clarity. Tonight it brought something else. Director Kim stood across the desk, posture straight, expression carefully neutral. In his hand was a thin sealed envelope. He didn't speak immediately. He didn't need to. Seo-Jin's gaze rested on the envelope for a long moment before he finally reached for it. His movements were slow, precise, as if speed might somehow change what waited inside. The seal broke with a soft tear. Paper slid free. The words were clinical, clean, unemotional. Probability of paternity, 99.98%. The world did not tilt. Nothing dramatic happened. Park Seo-Jin simply stopped. For a man who had trained himself to control every reaction, the stillness that followed was almost unnatural. Director Kim shifted slightly. "Sir." Seo-Jin lifted one hand. Silence. His eyes remained on the page, but he was no longer reading it. Numbers had never unsettled him before. Numbers were predictable. Numbers obeyed rules. These numbers rewrote them. Ethan, his son. The truth settled slowly, heavily, not like a shock, but like something inevitable finally arriving. A memory surfaced without permission. Rain against glass. Quiet voice. Nia standing too close. Seo-Jin's fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around the report. He had walked away. Not because he didn't feel, because he had felt too much. And now the past was standing in a small apartment across the city, tying tiny shoelaces and packing school lunches like the last 10 years had meant nothing. Director Kim spoke carefully, choosing each word. "How would you like us to proceed?" That was the question. In Seo-Jin's world, every confirmed fact required action. Every variable required control. But for the first time in years, the answer did not come immediately. His gaze drifted to the photograph lying beside the report. Ethan on the playground, small face calm, eyes far too observant for a child. His eyes. Seo-Jin exhaled slowly, the sound almost too quiet to hear. "Maintain surveillance," he said at last. Kim blinked once. "No contact, sir." Long pause. Then Seo-Jin's voice dropped, softer but edged with something new. Something far more dangerous than cold calculation. "Not yet." Because for the first time since building his empire, Park Seo-Jin was facing something he could not simply eliminate, outmaneuver, or buy. Blood. And blood he knew better than anyone. Never lied. Protection began quietly, the way Park Seo-Jin preferred most things. Within 48 hours of the DNA confirmation, subtle shifts rippled through the city. Small enough that no ordinary person would notice, precise enough that nothing around Nia Adeyemi or Ethan was left to chance. A patrol car now lingered more frequently near Ethan's daycare. The flickering streetlight outside Nia's apartment was replaced overnight. A man who had been watching the building from a parked motorcycle disappeared without explanation. Seo-Jin did not announce these changes. He simply allowed them to happen. From the shadowed interior of his office, multiple surveillance feeds glowed across the wall screens. His gaze moved methodically from one to the next, absorbing details with the same cold focus he used when studying enemy territory. Except this wasn't enemy territory. That was the problem. On the center screen, Ethan sat cross-legged on the daycare floor, carefully stacking bright plastic blocks. His small brow was slightly furrowed in concentration, serious in a way that made something unfamiliar tighten in Seo-Jin's chest. The boy didn't rush, didn't fidget, watched everything. Too much like him. Behind the glass, Director Kim stood quietly. We've increased perimeter monitoring around both locations. No unusual activity so far. Seo-Jin gave a single, almost absent nod. Financial review, he asked. Kim understood immediately. Ms. Adeyemi is 2 weeks behind on rent. She has been picking up additional shifts at the cafe. No outside support. Seo-Jin's expression did not change. But his fingers tapped once against the desk, a small, sharp sound in the otherwise silent room. 2 weeks behind. Working extra shifts. Still standing. Something unreadable moved behind his eyes. Anonymous assistance, Seo-Jin said calmly. Structure it through a housing relief grant. Make it untraceable. Kim hesitated. Yes, sir. Orders were given. Within days, Nia would receive an unexpected notice. Temporary rental support approved due to community funding adjustments. She would never know where it came from. Just as she would never know why the route Ethan's school bus took had been quietly altered to avoid a district recently flagged for gang movement. Or why 2 plainclothes men now rotated through the cafe where she worked. Soon leaned back slowly in his chair, gaze returning to the screen. Ethan had finished his block tower. For a brief second, the boy looked around, almost as if sensing something unseen, before giving a small, satisfied nod to himself. Seo-Jin's jaw tightened. Dangerous. This was becoming dangerous. Not because of enemies, but because the careful distance he had built between his world and theirs was already beginning to thin. Director Kim spoke cautiously. Sir, if this continues, people may begin to notice the resource allocation. Seo-Jin's voice came out smooth, controlled. Then make sure they don't. A beat of silence passed. But as Seo-Jin's gaze lingered on the quiet image of the boy on the screen, one truth settled heavily beneath his perfectly controlled exterior. For the first time in years, Park Seo-Jin wasn't just eliminating threats. He was guarding something. And that changed everything. The first sign came as a question. Quiet. Visual. Dangerous. Park Seo-Jin was midway through a late-night strategy meeting when Director Kim's secure phone vibrated once against the polished table. The interruption was subtle, almost polite, but Seo-Jin noticed immediately. He always did. Kim glanced at the message, and for the briefest second, something tightened around his eyes. Seo-Jin's voice cut smoothly through the room. Report. The single word emptied the air of pretense. Kim inclined his head slightly. There has been interest from the Han faction. Unofficial channels. Temperature dropped. Around the table, several senior men went very still. Seo-Jin did not move. Define interest, he said calmly. They've been mapping our recent resource shifts, Kim replied carefully. Increased surveillance units. Quiet financial movements. Route adjustments in sectors not typically prioritized. Then more quietly. They believe you're protecting something. Silence followed. Heavy. Measured. Seo-Jin's fingers rested loosely against the arm of his chair. His expression unchanged. But inside, calculations were already moving at lethal speed. The Han faction was not reckless. If they were asking questions, it meant patterns were becoming visible. And visible meant vulnerable. Across the table, one of the older executives spoke cautiously. Should we redirect assets, Chairman? Reduce the footprint. Seo-Jin's gaze shifted to him, slow and deliberate. The man immediately fell silent. Because everyone in the room understood one simple truth. Park Seo-Jin did not retreat. He studied the city map glowing across the digital table, eyes narrowing slightly as overlapping data points flickered into alignment. They were watching. Not close enough yet. Close. Director Kim spoke again, voice low. There's another development. Seo-Jin's attention sharpened. The Han faction recently increased activity in the district near Ms. Adeyemi's residence. The room went completely still. For the first time that night, Seo-Jin's fingers stopped moving. Just for a second. Then the motion returned. Slower now, more deliberate. Danger was no longer theoretical. It was drifting closer. Seo-Jin rose smoothly from his chair. The quiet authority in the movement enough to make every man at the table straighten instinctively. Expand outer surveillance, he ordered calmly. But nothing that links back to us. Kim nodded immediately. Understood. Seo-Jin's gaze moved once across the darkened window, the city lights reflecting coldly in his eyes. The Han faction thought they were observing a weakness. They thought they were seeing hesitation. They were wrong. Very wrong. Because Park Seo-Jin had not built his empire by reacting slowly. And if anyone allowed their curiosity to drift too close to Nia and Ethan, the consequences would not be quiet. Behind him, the room remained silent as his final words settled like a blade against glass. Let them watch, Seo-Jin said softly. Then colder. And prepare a reminder of what happens when they look too closely. The shift was subtle, but Nia felt it. It started 3 days after the rent relief notice appeared in her mailbox. A blessing she didn't question but didn't fully trust either. Life had taught her that help rarely came without a reason. Still, bills were bills. And survival came first. That afternoon, the cafe was unusually busy, the low hum of conversation blending with the sharp hiss of the espresso machine. Nia moved quickly behind the counter, balancing orders with the quiet efficiency she had perfected over the years. Mail. Serve. Move on. But halfway through her shift, the feeling returned. That prickling awareness at the back of her neck. Like someone was watching. Her hand paused briefly on the edge of a ceramic cup. Slowly, carefully, Nia lifted her gaze toward the front window. 2 men sat across the street. Plain clothes. Coffee untouched. Eyes moving too little for casual customers. Her stomach tightened. The moment stretched, thin and tense, before she forced herself to look away. Don't panic. Not yet. Across the city, Park Seo-Jin was already on his feet. Director Kim's voice came through the secure line, low and urgent. Unidentified observers confirmed near Ms. Adeyemi's workplace. Facial recognition flagged partial matches to Han-affiliated contractors. Seo-Jin's expression went very still. Too still. Distance, he asked quietly. Maintained for now. No direct approach. For now. Seo-Jin's jaw flexed once. The Han faction was no longer circling blindly. They were narrowing in. His gaze shifted to the live feed on the wall. Nia behind the cafe counter, shoulders straight, expression calm to anyone who didn't know what to look for. But Seo-Jin saw it. The micro-tension. The heightened awareness. She felt the pressure. And something cold and dangerous began to unfold inside him. Adjust the perimeter, Seo-Jin ordered smoothly. Rotate shadow teams. No escalation unless necessary. Kim hesitated. Sir, if they push closer. A long pause followed. Seo-Jin's eyes darkened slightly as he watched Ethan on the secondary screen, the boy carefully coloring at a daycare table, completely unaware of the storm slowly forming around him. When Seo-Jin spoke again, his voice was softer, far more dangerous. Then it becomes necessary. Back at the cafe, Nia finished her shift with steady hands and a calm face. But when she stepped outside into the cooling evening air, Ethan's small hand slipping trustingly into hers, her instincts screamed louder than before. The 2 men were gone, but the feeling remained. Watching. Waiting. Too close. Nia pulled Ethan slightly nearer as they walked. Across the city, Park Seo-Jin watched the same live feed. His expression carved from pure control. Because the line he had drawn in the shadows was beginning to blur. And if the underworld took one step closer to the small family walking through the evening streets, this would stop being quiet protection and start becoming war. Rain returned the night Park Seo-Jin decided to step out of the shadows. Not heavy, just enough to gloss the streets in silver and turn every passing headlight into something sharper, more dangerous. Nia noticed the black car the moment she exited the apartment building. It was parked too neatly, too deliberately. Her steps slowed, Ethan's small hand warm in hers as her instincts rose fast and sharp. Then the rear door opened, and the past stepped out. Park Seo-Jin looked exactly the same. That was the first cruel thing her heart registered. Same controlled posture, same unreadable face, same quiet gravity that seemed to bend the space around him. Even the rain sliding across his dark coat didn't soften the hard precision of him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The city noise faded into something distant. Ethan shifted slightly beside her, curious but calm, his fingers tightening gently around hers. Seo-Jin's gaze dropped. The world seemed to narrow to a single point. The resemblance was worse up close. Clear. Undeniable. Something dark moved behind Seo-Jin's eyes before his attention lifted slowly, deliberately, back to Nia. Mia. Her name sounded the same too. Low. Controlled. Dangerously familiar. Nia's spine straightened instinctively, every wall she had built over the years snapping firmly back into place. You shouldn't be here, she said quietly. No greeting. No softness. Only steel wrapped in calm. Seo-Jin absorbed that without flinching. If anything, something almost approving flickered deep in his gaze. You're being watched, he said. Direct. Unadorned. Nia's fingers tightened around Ethan's hand. I've handled worse. A dangerous silence stretched between them. Seo-Jin took one slow step closer. Not enough to threaten. Enough to change the air. That was before, he said quietly. For the first time, Ethan looked fully up at him. Those dark, steady eyes, so painfully familiar, met Seo-Jin's without fear. The impact hit harder than any weapon. Seo-Jin held the boy's gaze for one long second before something almost imperceptible shifted in his expression. When he spoke again, his voice had lowered. Not softer, but heavier. You struggled alone long enough, he said. Nia's breath caught despite herself. Seo-Jin's eyes lifted back to hers, steady, unyielding, and carrying a promise that felt far more dangerous than any threat. This time, he said quietly. Beat past. I'm not leaving. The rain fell a little harder. Nia's heart pounded once, hard enough to hurt, but her chin lifted, defiance still burning in her eyes. Because she knew better than anyone. When Park Seo-Jin stepped forward, nothing in her life would ever be simple again. By morning, the underworld felt the shift. Park Seo-Jin did not announce changes. He made them inevitable. In the top-floor war room, the air was tight with restrained tension as his senior executives stood in a silent semicircle. Screens glowed across the walls, displaying shipping routes, financial streams, territorial grids, the living blueprint of an empire built on precision and fear. Seo-Jin stood at the head of the table, expression carved from calm stone. But the orders he gave were anything but routine. Southern routes will be consolidated, he said smoothly. Non-essential operations within residential districts are to be phased out immediately. A ripple of surprise moved through the room before being quickly suppressed. That was unusual. Very unusual. Director Kim spoke carefully. Chairman, those sectors account for nearly 18% of. Seo-Jin's gaze lifted. Kim stopped. Because everyone in the room understood something fundamental had changed. Seo-Jin was not negotiating. He was restructuring. Long-term stability takes priority over short-term gain, Seo-Jin said calmly. Adjust accordingly. The words sounded strategic, rational. But the men in the room were not fools. They could see the pattern. Operations were being quietly redirected away from civilian-heavy zones. Surveillance resources were being expanded in one very specific district. Financial shells were being rearranged to create layers of insulation around assets that had never before required protection. Someone important had entered the board. And the king was moving pieces accordingly. Across the city, Nia locked the cafe doors at closing time, unaware that 2 blocks away, an entire surveillance grid had just been reassigned to her neighborhood. Or that the daycare Ethan attended now sat inside the most heavily monitored civilian radius Seo-Jin had ever authorized. Back in the tower, Seo-Jin studied the updated city map in silence. Cleaner, tighter, safer. For them. Director Kim stood beside him, voice low. The Han faction has already noticed the territorial consolidation. Seo-Jin didn't look away from the screen. Expected. They may interpret this as strategic withdrawal. Now Seo-Jin's gaze shifted, slow, cold, and faintly dangerous. Let them misunderstand. Because weakness had never been what he was offering. Only distance. Controlled distance. His eyes drifted briefly to the smaller monitor on the side of the display wall. Ethan sat at the kitchen table in Nia's apartment, carefully working through a brightly colored puzzle while Nia moved quietly in the background. Now. Something deep in Seo-Jin's chest settled into place. Not soft, not warm, but steady. Resolved. 4 years, Park Seo-Jin had built an empire designed to survive anything. Well, he was rebuilding it for something far more dangerous. When he finally spoke again, his voice was calm enough to chill the room. From this point forward, Seo-Jin said quietly, we don't just eliminate threats. Then colder. We prevent them. Behind him, the empire began to shift into its new shape. Not weaker, not softer, but far more precise. Because the most ruthless king in Seoul had finally identified the one thing in the world he could not afford to lose. And Park Seo-Jin did not lose what belonged to him.